get started, we want to do a quick poll of who's in the room. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. And very quickly, I'm going to launch a poll. We just want to see who's in the room with us. It's very good. It's helpful for both our speakers and ourselves just to see that. So as I launch my poll here, just launched it. So who's in the room? Are you a pre-seed or a founder, Series A, beyond, or Series A and beyond founder, investor, operator, aspiring founder? So we'll give it about 30 seconds for you all to vote. I see the votes coming in. We have a lot of pre-seed and seed founders in the room. That's great. Hi, Kendall. Welcome, welcome. About 10 more seconds and ending poll. And I'm just going to share the results with you. So it looks like 80% of us are in the pre-seed, seed, founding stages. 4% are Series A and beyond. About 9% are investors, 2% operators, and 6% aspiring founders. So thank you all. Oh, I'm glad that everyone liked the music. I'm going to keep doing that. So thank you again for all your feedback. It's so important to see what our audience likes. And so I hope, Divanny and Vanessa, that was helpful for you all to see who's in the room joining us today. And since I'm already bored of my voice, I definitely want to turn it over to you two to tell us a little bit more about yourselves, your background. And yeah, we'd love to hear who you are.
I'll jump in. Hi, everyone. My name is Vanessa Larco. I'm a partner at NEA. NEA is a big firm we span across the US, New York, San Francisco, DC. We invest in everything from seed to post-IPO, from healthcare services, enterprise SaaS, infrastructure, consumer, pretty much everything. We're a really big fund. I focus mostly on enterprise SaaS and a bit of consumer at the Series A and Series B. But before joining NEA, I spent most of my time all of my time in product, half of it in consumer product, half of it in enterprise. So I did a lot of gaming, console gaming, mobile gaming, desktop gaming, all kinds of gaming, and then went to Twilio, where I did product for the voice team, the voice API team, and then at Box, I ran product for all the front-end applications.
Thank you, Vanessa. Divanny.
Yes, hi everyone, I'm Divanny Lamas. I am a managing director at Sutter Hill Ventures. So Sutter Hill Ventures is a very old firm, founded in 1962. We do investments in a lot of hard tech areas. That includes enterprise, B2B. I do a lot of things on the kind of enterprise side, anywhere from IT infrastructure, developer tooling, all the way to cybersecurity. But as a firm, we do investments in other hard tech things like chips and self-driving cars, and kind of relatively large check sizes. We do anywhere from $1 million to 150 million, but with a really, really big focus on kind of seed and incubation. I'm also the CEO of Transposit. It's one of the portfolio companies for Sutter Hill Ventures. We're kind of weird as a firm, and so oftentimes we'll wear CEO hats, and we like to keep our hands dirty and continue being operators even while we are also VCs. So Transposit is a company in the DevOps and SRE automation space. Before Sutter Hill and Transposit, I worked in lots of enterprise B2B product and field roles. I started off my career at Evernote very early on when it was like 10 people, and I did support from my dorm room. Went to Google and spent time at Google working on Docs and Suite, and did a little bit of time in gaming as well at a company called OnLive. And then I was early on in the product team at Splunk. I ended up running product for Splunk. Was there for about 9 years. I also ran a bunch of teams on the field side. So I've kind of worn both hats, both field, sales engineering, customer success, all those types of things, and new product introduction and go-to-market strategy, as well as leading a lot of product teams. So I think that between Vanessa and me, you guys have a pretty broad diversity of experiences in product market fit.
Yes, yes. Thank you for the background. I think it's always great to see where our speakers are from and their trajectories. And without further ado, we're all here to really learn about product market fit. So I'd love to hear from you both. what exactly is product fit, and how can you share a little bit about how you define it? And Vanessa, we'll have you lead off.
Yeah, I think in its most basic form, you have a value proposition for what your product or your service does for a certain person or persona or group of people. And I think product market fit is when you're able to show that you're delivering on that value for those people that you're targeting. And there's a million different ways to measure that, but I think at its core, that's really what you're trying to gauge.
Yeah, I kind of think of it very similarly to Vanessa. In my view, there's really a few pieces that are part of building product market fit. You've got customers, you've got product, and you've got market, right? And for me, it's that moment when you know that the solution that you're bringing to the market meets the needs of that market. And there's lots of ways of measuring that, whether it's customers or revenue or adoption or whatever it might be. But fundamentally, you're in a great market, and that market has accepted the solution that you've built as solving the needs of the market.
Nice, nice. And as you talk about product market fit, and I'm thinking about all the founders in the room who are in pre-seed and seed, what would you say what is the process to finding it? What are the steps there? I know there's no right or wrong reason, but Divanny, why don't you lead us off?
The steps towards finding product market fit. So I always think of it as, kind of every single time that we have a hypothesis on how we're going to, what we think the market needs and our solution to it, the process is basically running a bunch of experiments. And kind of getting the results of those experiments and feeding that into the next experiments. There are places that kind of like you hit product market fit, and like you have a hypothesis, you build a solution, you launch the solution, and then you get it out into the market, and it takes off like crazy. And but that's a rarity usually. So for a lot of the people on the pre-seed and seed side, kind of as founders here, I'd say for me it's getting to the point where you have those hypotheses really well defined and starting to run those experiments in whatever form you want to run those experiments. And, kind of, I've seen anything from people who will go and build out a pitch deck and then just go and talk to people and show them the deck before you've ever written a line of code, all the way to people who will launch websites and start sending them out and, kind of figuring out if people click on the button that you start to use to sell your solution, all the way to, kind of starting to work with customers directly and founding customer kinds of programs. But really, there's a variety of ways to get there.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I think it's really hard to get it right off the bat. You would probably go through many iterations at the early stages of your product or service. I think the key is to try to get feedback from users, either qualitative or quantitatively. To do it quantitatively, you need a lot of volume. So you either need a really clever way of getting, hundreds of users, or you really focus on doing small focus groups and getting feedback that way. And there's other ways of doing that. But I think, it's trying to understand what motivates your users. Does your solution really solve a pain point? Is what you're solving with your solution actually better than what they're using? And so a lot of times I see a bit of a disconnect there, where sometimes paper and pen is just easier, even if it's not ideal, even though sometimes it gets lost, even though it's not perfect, but it might be easier for some users than doing it on an iPad. And so I think understanding how much benefit are you providing your customers, and what's the cost for them to switch, and is the benefit enough for them to actually switch from what they're using today to what you're offering them.
All right. And I'm sure a lot of the founders on the call right now are like, I have all these customers, people are coming in, but with your investor hat and your operator hat, what do you say to the founders how do they know that they achieve product market fit or not? Can you share some examples from either previous experiences or challenges that you've seen across the board in your work? And Divanny, why don't you lead us off here?
Yeah, I think it's a little different for every company. But some of the signals that I look for that make it feel like product market fit has been achieved, things just feel like they're clicking. It's more of a feeling than a specific number or kind of milestone. But, kind of that can look like word of mouth, right? So word of mouth starts happening. And that could be word of mouth either from other investors, from reporters, like you start having reporters reach out and say, hey, I heard about your solution. I want to learn more. Or the best one, you start having customers come to you word of mouth, perhaps even before you really turned on your marketing engine, and they start talking to you. Another one, especially if you're pre-revenue, so if you're still in the discovery phases, is people start trying to give you money. So, you'll talk to people and you'll be like, so I have this idea, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, blah, 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 blah. Maybe you give them a little demo, but it's, like we all know that it's a baked demo. It's not a great demo yet. And at the end of the conversation, they're like, great, I would like to buy this solution. How can I give you money? And you're like, oh, well, we're still in beta, blah, blah, blah. And like if they're really insistent, you have something. If you've already started the sales process, another thing that I like to say is, are the wheels coming off the bus? So is customer support overwhelmed? Is sales overwhelmed? Are you having a hard time, kind of hitting all of the people that want to buy your solution? And, kind of you're having to hire and hire and you can't hire fast enough. Those are all signs of product market fit. But there's lots of little micro signs on the way there that you can use, because that's really when you've achieved it. And, I think Vanessa mentioned this earlier. The bigger problem that I find is that most people feel like they've hit product market fit and they haven't hit product market fit. So it's easy to declare victory early sometimes. But Vanessa, I don't know what you think.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. So agreed. When people are trying to become paying customers before you're ready, that's a fantastic sign that you're on to solving a real problem. You don't really know if your solution's working yet at that point, but it's a very good sign. The other thing, I think my favorite signal of product market fit is when customers are telling other potential customers about you. So if one of your customers is just so excited and you've solved their problem that they're referring people at other companies to talk to you, that's just a fantastic sign. It's not common, especially in the early stage, but I think that's one of the holy grails, at least on the enterprise side. On the consumer side, you'll notice that just customer acquisition just gets easier. Either your cost per user acquisition starts coming down, your blended cost will come down because you're getting more organic installs. If you're an app, you start climbing in the app charts. Like there's many different ways to see it, but typically some metric will start really taking off. Not all of them, and some of them will tank. But there's like some glimmer of hope that you're like, oh, wait, something's happening here. And I think in the early stages, you need to find that something that is actually working, because not everything's going to work.
Nice. And we have a question from the audience, Akta, and sorry if I mispronounced your name. So as a startup, what if we've started with a more transaction fee and then using that learning as a pivot to platform? What are some learnings or singles, good or bad? We have customers which validates the problem we are solving manually today, but looking to pivot to a platform.
So let me read this question. So if we started with a more transaction fee and then are pivoting to platform. So, I think so here's what I'll say about platform in general. I'm a big believer in this. People buy a solution. You can build a platform, they'll buy a solution. So very often when people tell me I'm selling a platform, kind of even the things that are the most platformiest platforms, they started off with some use case that they were really solving. So I would pivot that question to ask, what is the problem that those customers have? And is your pricing model, is your sales acquisition strategy, so the strategy that you're using, whether that's a direct sales strategy or whatever it might be, are all of those pieces firing on all cylinders for those customers? And if you have a pricing strategy, because I think that that question in particular kind of points me towards like you're changing your pricing model substantially. Platform-oriented pricing models, kind of have lots of different types of things that you want to look for based off of, but I would still boil it down to use cases, right? Even if you have like a platform pricing model, at the end of the day, it's like for a use case, how well am I solving it? And are like people pushing back on my pricing that I've given them, even if I've repositioned it as a platform pricing model?
Yeah, I would say that at every company I worked for, we started off as a product, and then we decided we should be a platform because they tend to think that platforms can monetize better. And half of the time it worked, and half of the time our platform was just a way to customize the app we'd built in an easier way, and didn't necessarily drive more revenue. So I would really think about what's pulling you to be a platform. And know that at the end of the day, you have to have solutions on it. And every company that we funded that was a platform ended up building apps on top of their platform to get their ecosystem going. And when they sell to customers, it's really just selling the solution. And then the dream of like, oh, and if you want to build your own solutions, we have this platform. But rarely do they start with like, I want to build my own solution. I want a lot of tools and I want to pay you money for it. I haven't actually ever seen that happen.
Thank you for the feedback. Very, very helpful. And then, so I've heard both of you kind of talk about sales. Can you dive a little bit deeper into how sales plays into finding product market fit at early stage enterprise companies? What does that mean and look like?
I would say it depends on whether you're consumer or enterprise. If you're consumer, it's you don't really typically have a sales team unless you're trying to sell to wholesale or something like that. Even then, you're B2B. So in consumer, it's really the product that's your sales engine. It's how do you convert people within your product to start paying you. And that's exciting because it typically falls either on some growth team or on the product management team to figure out how to get that to happen. On the enterprise side of the house, I would say really early on, we hope to see one of the co-founders be the salesperson. Because when you're out there trying to sell your product, you're going to get a ton of feedback. Half of it or more is going to be useless, but there will be some nuggets in there that will really challenge your thinking and your product direction. And product and sales have to be tied so closely together that like, it's got to be a co-founder that's out there getting that initial feedback, seeing what it's like to try to sell something like this. So, I don't think people should hire a sales rep off the street until you're a little later on and know that the product can sell.
So I'll be a little controversial here. And I think that there's two different types of market approaches when you're an enterprise B2B company. So one of them is category creation, right? So that basically means that your company, the problem that you're solving has never been solved before by a company, or if it's been solved before, it's been solved in a very different way. So you are the first of your kind. And, a really great example. So I used to work at Splunk, and Splunk, when Splunk came into existence, the idea of logs, like people didn't really think of logs as something that you would pay money for, right? It was this thing that was, kind of machine detritus that sysadmins cared about, but pretty much no one else did. And so Splunk came in and said, we're going to make machine data a thing. And it was a slog. I think that one of the characteristics of companies that are category creating companies is that it takes a long time for those companies to get going, because you're both educating the market as well as building out a solution that's never been built before, but they have wonderful potential. And for those companies, 100% founder-led sales are the only way to go, because the founder is the only one that's going to be able to tell the story and the vision of what you're trying to build out. And you need a very, very tight relationship between product and, kind of the selling motion and all those pieces. You also want to stay as lean as possible for as long as possible, because until you hit product market fit, it's going to be really hard for you to grow. Now, there's another category of company, and that's, you know, the better, faster, cheaper category. So I have a technology that is out there today, and I'm going to build something that's 100 to 1,000 times better than it. So, you know, kind of an example in our portfolio of that is Snowflake. So, you know, kind of Snowflake came into the data warehouse market, and there were data warehouses before, but Snowflake was better and it was in the cloud. It was just fundamentally better technology. It was 1,000 times faster. It was, you know, kind of all the numbers, and the founders came from that background. You know, they had been at Oracle. They saw the opportunities and gaps in that solution. So when you're in that latter category, I actually think that you can use sales as a really interesting way of getting early feedback. And the reason I say that is you kind of already know you have more constraints, right? So you know that the market can support a large product because there's already large products that are in that market. And what I love about salespeople is that salespeople don't lie. You know, they don't get lost by like, as a founder, one of the most difficult things is to be intellectually honest with yourself about what people are saying. Same thing is true for product managers. You know, kind of product managers are the CEOs of their own products. But salespeople, you know, they know that in order to eat, they have to sell the product. So they are completely unvarnished in their feedback. And so you can use sales early on at companies that are going after very specific types of models to do that early validation. But realize that those salespeople are going to be really frustrated because they're going to have a hard time hitting their numbers early on. And you're going to have to basically guide them through the process of helping you discover that product market fit. But when you can do that because you have the right funding and you have the right market and you have the right opportunity, it's invaluable. But, you know, for 95% of cases, 90% of cases, you're probably better off going with the approach that Vanessa mentioned.
Yeah, and there's one hybrid business model that has really emerged in the last few years that we didn't mention here, which is the bottoms up enterprise SaaS, like the Notions and Figmas of the world, and even Dropbox, because they haven't really figured out enterprise sales, I'd say. And that's when you're doing B2B, but you're really targeting SMB or viral adoption, where your price point's really cheap. You can convert the individual employee for a few bucks a month, and they take out their credit card to pay for it. And your goal there is to then eventually be able to upsell the whole organization on an enterprise package. And that's actually a hybrid of consumer user acquisition. So you have to get a lot of people to use your product like you would in consumer, and you have to convert them within the product like consumer. And then you have to layer on enterprise to be able to aggregate all of those groups of people and companies to then upsell to have a more meaningful source of revenue by each company. And so that model is actually doing really well. It's really novel. And I don't think there's a lot of best practices around it, but it's a hodgepodge of the two worlds really melding together.
Yeah, and I think that in that model, you know, we had a little bit of that at Splunk, certainly not to the degree of something like a Dropbox or a Notion. But what we found was, you know, you've got to kind of look at your own strengths and skill sets, honestly. And if you have traction on the, you know, kind of individual buyer, oftentimes these, you know, kind of expansion deals involve a lot of traditional sales skill sets because it's a lot of like coalescing people. And in those cases, it might be worth looking at sales earlier than you would otherwise.
Nice. Thank you both for that. And so as we think about sales, I think something else that comes top of mind is just thinking about the market and how to identify the market when you're trying to find product market fit. How do you go about picking one and then going after it? What are some metrics or tactics there that founders should be thinking as they do that?
Divanny, you want to take this one?
Sure. So I am a big believer that the market is more important than pretty much anything else. So I think the market is more important oftentimes than your product. The market is often more important than the team even. And again, controversial opinions with Divanny. The reason I believe that is if you've got a big market, and by market, I think that oftentimes people talk about markets, and when they talk about markets, they talk about you know, kind of all women, right? Like obviously that's a big market. But it's important to look at what are people spending money in that market today. So when I say market, I really mean like places where people are spending money. If you pick a market where people are already spending money on a solution, it just gives you so many more options, especially if that market is growing quickly. So like, why have we seen so many data companies get invested in the enterprise B2B space, or right now, you know, kind of remote work companies? It's like, well, it's a very fast growing market and there's a lot of opportunities to solve problems in it. And people are already spending money and open to spending more money because, you know, the problems are getting harder and harder. So it's really important to be very honest with yourselves, especially as those pre-seed and seed founders, of the market that you're actually going after and what it can really support. Because that's kind of like the biggest thing that I hear from frustrated founders who are like pre-seed or seed founders. They'll come to me and they're like, I have a great team, I have a great idea, we're going to do this really great thing, and VCs won't listen to me. And, you know, kind of the answer is always like, well, what's the market? And then they're like, all right, so here's my math. And, you know, like you start seeing like TAM bubbles and smaller bubbles and smaller bubbles. And then, you know, kind of you multiply these things. There's like a bunch of like funny jokes about it. But I think that it's just very, very critical to pick markets that you have expertise in, that you know are growing quickly, that you know will support some spend. And, you know, kind of ideally, you know, you're able to come in and disrupt something with your fundamentally better approach from a technology perspective, or, you know, because there's a disruptor in the industry in general, like remote work, for example.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I would say market can take many different forms. It could be where your competitors, it could be where you're, sometimes you'll be like, people build this in-house and they hobble these solutions together. And if you join them together, I just think you have to know exactly who you're going after at first. And it could be a really small segment of people, and that's fine, as long as you know how you're going to expand. You can even start in a specific vertical. You could go after, I don't know, automotive or telecom, and you just feel like your solution is just really well positioned with what you have today to go after that segment. And I wouldn't be afraid of that, because you can get some virality within really narrow industries. And then as long as you don't get pigeonholed and you can expand beyond that, I think that's fine. But you have to be, like Divanny said, very conscious about, are you creating a new market, or are you playing in an existing market, and why would you win either?
Oh, sorry, multitasking here.
Yeah.
There's a couple of, so as we speak about markets and sales, I see a couple of questions from the audience asking about pricing. So at the pre-seed phase, when you haven't nailed pricing yet, you know, and you're working with companies that successfully built or showcase traction without knowing exactly how pricing and commercialization would shake out. And so figuring out, how does pricing work? And there was a, yeah, how do you really nail that?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the questions is, you know, kind of like, have you seen companies hit that without the pricing model figured out? Absolutely. You know, I think that oftentimes pricing changes and evolves over time. Like, pricing is a technique that you can use as part of finding product market fit. If there is demand for your, like, if you have like true product market fit, you know, kind of the pricing can certainly harm you. But in general, you know, it's like people will tell you. Like, people will tell you, like, this is a little different, you know, kind of like if you're on the more, you know, bottoms up, or if you're doing more of a consumer style model, you'll see it in the numbers, you know, and you can run experiments, and there's lots of ways to do that and lots of documented things online. But if you're doing sales, people will tell you. They'll be like, hey, I really love your solution. You know, it's like, Marian, your solution's great. I really love it. This is going to solve all my problems for me. I've done my trial. I really like it. But let me tell you, your pricing just doesn't make any sense. And what I always tell people is, like, if you're not getting any pushback, then you're probably underpricing. So that's like the one like true fact that I have. But yeah, I see it more as a way of driving whatever forces you think are beneficial to your product. kind of in systematic ways. So for example, if you want to have a product that scales usage, but you don't want to penalize people, you can use per user pricing, right? Because you're like, I really want people to go deep on using it, and I don't want to penalize usage. If you're on the infrastructure side, sometimes you can make it a little bit easier by using utility pricing or resource pricing, right? But it's just like ways of basically hacking around the core fundamentals of, are you solving a problem for people that they really care about? Vanessa, I know that you've like done a lot more of this, especially at scale.
That's absolutely right. I think the one thing I learned when I was at Box was we had per seat pricing with like bundled with features. But once you get really far down the line, you start getting big customers asking you to build very niche features that may only make sense either for them or for a very small subsector of your customer base. But those people are willing to pay a lot of money for it. So should you just build it and put it into the enterprise top tier, or should you create an additional like layer on SKU? And that's the direction we ended up going in, which was like, at some point you don't want all your features that you're building to just go to everyone, people that don't even value them, and you'll never see an uptick in revenue. So what we did was we created these like additional add-on packages to like the standard enterprise. So if you wanted like these very sophisticated knobs and whistles for security customization, then we would sell that package on top of your per seat, per user pricing. And that would include a lot of features that didn't mean anything to like 99% of our customer base, but that 1% was willing to pay a lot of money for that bundle of features. But it evolves. It just evolves. At every phase of your company, pricing just evolves. Even if you're public, even the big ones, like pricing continues to evolve. So it's never anything that's going to stay stagnant. So I would expect to revisit this every year, every 2 years, no matter what.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say here is I'm a VC, obviously, so I often work with companies that are VC funded. And I think that often when I work with my companies, I encourage them not to think too much about revenue early on, and to focus instead on, pricing should not be a detractor. So, I kind of said before, like pricing can be a detractor. Don't make pricing a detractor. If kind of being creative with your pricing and, kind of like sell to people in the way they want to be sold to. So if people like buying per user in your market, don't be afraid to sell per user. Now, if people don't like per user and you can disrupt them by coming in with a different pricing model, then that might be worth exploring. But I would almost always optimize for being able to get more companies, more people, more usage of my solution than kind of optimizing to get every single cent from the company. Because chances are, as Vanessa mentioned, you're going to get more and more functionality over time. And there are ways of monetizing that as you grow that you may not be able to think about right now. Now, this is all completely different if you're completely bootstrapped. If you're bootstrapped, get revenue and don't listen to anything we're saying.
Sure. Yeah, I like 100%. I was meeting with an early stage founder recently. I was getting a lot of pushback on his monetization model, and people just didn't want to sign up for an enterprise SaaS solution. They didn't want to sign up for recurring payments for a year. And his model really lent itself really well for transactional fees. It's like, well, why don't you just sell them a package of transactional fees? And then like when they use all of it, because you see that their usage pattern is really high, like in a month or two, they're going to come back and be like, this doesn't make any sense. Let's go enterprise SaaS. But like, don't fight it. And he's like, well, transaction fees is a bad word for VCs. I'm like, just do what your customers need you to do and trust yourself, right? You know that if at a certain point, transaction fees are just going to get messy and credits and this and that, it's just going to be easier for them, but they don't understand that right now. So like play ball, right? Like go along with it. So, just don't, I think sometimes founders get caught in this trap of trying to over optimize for what they think VCs want to hear. And then you just stop listening to your customers or you start swimming against the current. And I would advise you to just trust your gut, trust what you're hearing from people. It will work out if you're right. And if you're wrong, you would have been wrong anyway. So better to be wrong with going following your gut than trying to optimize for people you haven't really spent time with.
Oh, such great gems. Like I'm learning so much and there's so many great questions. And I think that hit a lot of the questions coming in for some of our founders and just like making, I think Divanny, you said it yourself, don't make the pricing your detractor, right? There's a lot more to that. And something too that just wondering, so like what happens if your initial attempts at finding product market fit don't work? What are some pivots that you have all seen founders make, or challenges that they've worked through that some of our founders can really learn from?
I mean, we've seen all kinds of things. We've seen gaming companies become enterprise SaaS companies. We've seen enterprise SaaS companies become consumer companies. I mean, I think the key is just when it's not working, try to figure out what pieces are working. I think the hardest piece that no one can answer accurately is you're going to get a lot of feedback of like, oh, you're doing X, you should be totally doing Y. And, a lot of the time you get rewarded for being like, no, we're doing X. I believe in X, and that's what we're going to do. And you get rewarded and you hear great stories about the person who resisted the pivot and was right. And then you hear about the person who was like, you know what? I don't think X is actually working. I should totally do Y. And then everyone's like, oh, they listened and that's why it worked. And they went with Y and they were right. And it's like 50-50. So I don't have good advice on like, when should you actually take the advice and pivot? And when should you dig in your heels and be like, you don't see what I see, I'm right. I think part of it is luck, part of it is art, and very little of it is actually science.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I think that there are ways that you can try to reduce your risk. You can take an approach where, people have talked a lot about MVPs. I always talk about minimum useful product, not minimum viable product, because like minimum viable you can also do reputation damage, especially if you have a relatively small number of customers that you're going after. But you can do lots of things to try to get more things, like get more at-bats is kind of the way that I think about it. Because if you've got, kind of a seed check, you're only going to get so many tries at doing that. So beyond trying to change direction when you have decided that it's not working, which to Vanessa's point, no one can tell you when it's working or not working, move as fast as you can. That's the best advice I have.
All right, thank you. And then based on your experiences, could you both speak on how did you run your initial customer development strategy? Where did you find the customers to talk to? How did you use their testing cheaply? Just like best practices that founders can kind of take with them to do tomorrow.
Yeah, so how to do it quickly. I mean, I'm a big fan of cold calling, right? So I remember when I first jumped into Transposit, I was on LinkedIn stalking people that could be good customers for me and just calling them up and, messaging them and saying, hey, I have a thing, you want to talk? So I think that the most important thing is for you as the founder to be as actively involved in talking to people, in getting into people's, getting in front of people, getting feedback from as many people as possible. You'll find that after 200, 300 conversations with your target, especially if you have like a well-defined target, you'll start seeing truth and you'll start seeing kind of like a lot of truth behind it. I've never really been a fan of, kind of things around buying users and things like that. I think that it makes a little bit more sense on the consumer side, but on the enterprise side, on the B2B side, I always just run a sales process. And at the beginning, I'm selling, kind of a PowerPoint. And then by the end, I'm selling a solution. But I always run it as a sales process. And I always track, okay, how many of my sales converted? How many people got onto my alpha list if I didn't have anything built yet? how many people, you know, kind of made it past the, you know, kind of first stage of tech validation to the second stage. You know, like I've always been very, very oriented around, like, I'm going to run this like a sales process. I'm going to have qualification criteria after each of those conversations, and I'm going to make sure that I'm converting as many of them as I can. And if my conversion rate is too low, if I can't find enough people willing to talk to me, then there's a problem either on the messaging side, or there's a problem on some element of how I'm telling the story, of how I'm selling the process, you know, selling the solution. Maybe the salesperson is shitty, right? Like when I've been the salesperson, sometimes the salesperson doesn't know how to do her job. And, you know, kind of that could also be a problem. But I'm just a fan of like getting out there and talking to as many people as you can.
Yep. And I was reading, I was just reading about a lot of different case studies, and you know, a lot of the companies in Silicon Valley that started doing well just reached out to their network. They were like, I used to work with this person that is now in customer support, and I'm building something in customer support. I'm going to just call them and ask for a favor and see if they'd use it. One of our portfolio companies is building design software. And so I called up my friend who now leads design at Xbox, and I was like, hey, can you bang on this and tell me, like, does it make sense? And hop on a call with the founder and I. And so you got to get really comfortable asking for favors, for cold calling, for just putting yourself out there. There's just no substitute for that.
Yes, and I think that's something that some people shy away from. But in terms of trying to find your customers and developing that strategy, what are some pitfalls or like mistakes that you think founders make along the way that you would just like to share with our founders on the call?
I have
big mistakes.
Yeah, I have one that comes to mind. So I think that you need to think about how your customers buy solutions and make sure that the way that you are selling to them makes sense for how they buy solutions. And so kind of a common pitfall that I see is people who don't think about segmentation of their customer base and of how to sell to different elements of that segmented base. So for example, you know, if you think of customers as a little pyramid, and then you've got SMB at the bottom, and then you've got mid-market, and then you've got enterprise or majors at the top. The way that a majors account or an enterprise account buys is going to be fundamentally different than how an SMB buys. But oftentimes, you know, I'll have people come to me who are in the seed or pre-seed stage, and they're like, oh yes, we are building a product for you know, the American Expresses of the world and for mom and pop barbershops. And I'm like, well, that's great. It's great that you're building that. You know, oftentimes it's the same platform people who are like, we're building a platform, so it'll work for both of them. And I'm like, well, that's really great. It's very possible that your solution has technical elements that could be useful to both. But there's going to be a long tail of feature requests for both of them. And at some point, they're going to divide, which is why a lot of companies, you know, often, Vanessa was mentioning this earlier, don't be afraid of picking like a niche market and, you know, kind of just going after it and executing very well on it. Because oftentimes you'll find that the market is bigger than you expected it was. So like think of something like Shopify. Shopify went after SMBs, and they built their entire engine oriented at going after SMBs. That's very different than a company like Workday or Viva. You know, you guys have probably never heard of Viva. So Viva is a major company. I think they're 45 billion market cap. And Viva sells to pharma companies. So I think if you look at the number of customers that they're selling to, it's maybe 40, 50 companies total. And each of those companies is paying them tens of millions of dollars. And they're about the same valuation as like a Datadog or, you know, kind of a half the valuation of a ServiceNow, like big companies with like massive concentration. But when you look at what they built and how they built it, they have a very services heavy business, or they started off with a services heavy business. They went and they hired, you know, kind of very experienced salespeople. They built a fundamentally different company, and they built a different sales model and a different sales strategy to do that. So just be very, very, very aware of who you are selling to, who your ideal customer profile is, and make sure that however you're selling to them, and, you know, like, I'm not judgmental whether you're doing it, you know, kind of in a super high velocity, low friction way, or you've decided to climb the mountain, you know, kind of you're doing it in a way that makes sense to that buyer.
Yeah, and I'll just point out in Divanny's example that when Shopify was going after SMBs, that was not popular. Like VCs were like, wait, where's your sales team? what's your average sales price? Like, how are you ever going to
That
make
ASP is too low. How are you going to be able to build a company with that ASP? I think they're like 135 billion now.
This is why, like, you can't optimize for VCs, because some of the greatest companies that have just not been built. So I just want to like highlight that point, that we are often very wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm looking at time, so I'm going to start going into some of our questions from the audience. So from Hazel, my company is using AI-powered biocensus to fight COVID in the workplace. We have a B2B model and are struggling with pricing, as the businesses who have asked for our solution want to buy from us are also the most hard hit by the pandemic: senior homes, nonprofits, et cetera. How do you approach pricing in this situation?
Maybe for these, one of us just takes it quickly so we can get through all of them. In this case, it's really important that you show them either how much money they're going to save by what they're spending, or how much more money they'll make because they're using your solution. If you're not helping them reduce cost or increase revenue, it's going to be nearly impossible for them to pay you. So you really have to get that piece right and believable and backable by data. And, you know, you can maybe think of like a rev share model if you are increasing their revenue, or something to just say like, as you make more money, you pay us, or as you decrease costs, whatever. But try to make it so that they realize that their business will be way better off because of your solution. And if they're still not willing to pay you, then like, I don't know that you have something that's a business.
All right. And then from Nicole, should we charge our early customers for pilots? Is it okay to charge at a cost?
I think it kind of depends on how much it costs you to run a pilot. So if running a pilot is very, very expensive for you and it takes you 2 people on your side and lots of engineering resources, absolutely charge them for the pilot. But, you know, kind of, I think in general, it comes back to the market that you're going after. Like, are you going to feel comfortable charging for pilots for eternity? Because your typical deployment takes 2 months and it's super hands-on and it's super expensive. If not, I'd figure out how to get that pilot to be a lot lighter weight and turn it more into a trial.
Nice. And then from Trisha, when should you start tackling new verticals / new products for B2B companies?
When your customers pull you into it, I would say. If you're just not getting traction with what you've got now and you have to build a bunch of other stuff to get onesies and twosies, you don't have something that's really scalable. And I would really think about, should you just pivot and really focus on this new thing you're building? But if at the core it's working really well, then like, where's the bulk of your customers asking for functionality? Or if there's an industry adjacent to the one you're serving really well that needs like a line of features to like really break in. But if you're doing it because you need to figure out, or you need more customers and you're just like grasping at onesies and twosies, I'd be very careful. That's something people fall into the trap pretty frequently.
Yeah, rule of thumb for us is that you should be able to do $1 billion in revenue on your first product, right? Like your market should be able to support that if you're going to do venture funding at the scale that we do. And so, you know, kind of to Vanessa's point, when we were at Splunk, we started off in the IT space. We started off selling to sysadmins, and then we got really dragged by customers into the security space. They were using it for security purposes before we built out any functionality around it. So if you start seeing a consistency in off-shelf, like off-brand use, then it's interesting. But I certainly wouldn't expand out because you need to increase your potential market. Like that's a bad sign.
Okay. And Athena, how do you think about landing and expanding versus acquiring new customers?
Landing, what's the question?
Basically expanding your current base, so upsells versus new revenue. You want a mix of both. You absolutely need to make sure that you're keeping, so first of all, keep your customers. If you have high churn, you just have this leaky bucket. So as you pour more customers in and people come falling out the back end, like that's a bad sign. So actually talking about mistakes, I see a lot of startups, like they lock in a bunch of deals and they're just like trying to go for new ones. And then they like, their first customer churns and they're like, oh, no big deal. I have 3 other ones. I'm like, no, this is a big deal. This is like the first customer you got and they churned. Do we know why? Like this, we like hold the phone. So first I would think retain. Then if you're retaining and making happy, you should see upsell. But you still need new customers. But I like the retain and upsell model because the happier those customers are and the more they adopt of your product, the more likely they are to recommend it to other people, and it just gets easier to acquire new customers.
Yeah, you'll also see that changes over time and flops in one direction or another. So, you know, kind of sometimes you'll get to the point where you've saturated some of the accounts that you're in and you don't have lots of new product functionality to continue expanding in which case you might switch your focus to more customer acquisition and logo acquisition. So, you know, like I think that over my career, I have seen this shift where it's like every 6 months, it's the shift. Okay, right now we're in land and expand and we're like focusing on expanding. Now we're focusing on new logos, and it's always like pivoting from one direction to another. But the one thing that you've got to be careful is that you're not a leaky bucket and that you're losing people, to Vanessa's point.
All right. And Julie, our product assists employers increase productivity and reduce stress for parents working from home. Our product aggregates employers' busy times and when they need activities for their kids and allows parents to book these activities through the app. We have our product away to our first customer and have new features coming out to upsell. But is this freemium mode a good approach to get customers initially?
I mean, Vanessa, this is pretty similar to the one that you answered earlier around biosensors, right? Like to me, it comes back to how are you, you know, kind of you've got to map it to increase productivity or revenue, like ultimately revenue for the company in some way. So if you can do that mapping and you can help employers understand that, you know, like I think that freemium models, like I don't like giving things away for free in general. But that's me.
I would say the freemium model works if you need to get a bunch of employees to download the app without their employer telling them about it. So like you need them to find it on the App Store and download it and love it and then tell their employer, can you pay for this for me so that I can whatever. Then the freemium works. But if you're just giving it to the buyer, the employer for free, and they're just like, this is great, but they don't feel like it's adding enough value to pay you, then the freemium model totally falls apart. You may want to consider like a 60-day trial. And I would even make that probably paid so that they're encouraged to promote it to their employees. Because if it's a free pilot for something like a benefit, an employee benefit, then they're like, yeah, sure, they'll sign up for every free benefit, but they won't promote it to their employees. And then it's on you to promote it to the employees. And then when it doesn't work out, they just cut you. So you just have to be really, really careful with the freemium model when it's given to employers, especially HR and benefits.
All right. And looking at time, the last question is more of the closing question. But for both of you, what would you say is the most important question a founder should be asking while assessing their product market fit? Like if they had to think about that one thing, one or two things, keeping top of mind.
I think we covered it. I don't know what else I would really add other than like, how do you measure the value you're providing to your customers? Is it active usage? Is it conversion to paid? Is it, you know, how do you know if it's a productivity app, like how do you know that you're actually making those people more productive? Is it because they're using you 5 days a week? Is it because maybe it's your product's not a daily active kind of product, but you're deeply integrated in a workflow and you're a key piece to it. And so retention's really high. Or, you know, I think there's a million different ways. You just have to figure out like, how do you know? How would you see it in data if what you're doing is actually driving value?
All right, thank you, thank you. And Divanny?
I would say keep things lean, because oftentimes you think that you're going to hit product market fit and then it's a psych, you were actually fooling yourself and something will happen. You reserve a lot more optionality if you keep things as lightweight as possible, as long as possible. So, kind of like I don't know that I'd call this a question, I think that, but, like the question that I would ask myself in that position is, do I know, kind of like, until I know what my next 10 hires are going to be doing exactly, and that those 10 hires, like when I think about exactly what they're going to be doing, like they're going to be bringing in new customers, new revenue, whatever metrics I've kind of defined for myself, like I know that those 10 people are going to be able to get to work and they're going to be able to be productive very quickly. I would be very weary of scaling, and even sometimes fundraising for the next round. Because that's going to be the, like you might get the money, but then you're kind of stuck in this catch-22 where you're like, I have all this money, but now I don't know what to do with it.
Nice, nice. Well, it is almost, we're almost at time, and I know there were so many questions coming in. So thank you all who joined us today. And most of all, thank you, Divanny and Vanessa, for joining us and sharing all of these nuggets. So helpful, I know, especially for the founders on the call. Really appreciate your time, and thank you again. And we look forward to maybe seeing you down the line. There will be a recording of this session, which we will share out with you all within the next 24 hours. And yes, thank you again, Divanny and Vanessa. It has been such a pleasure. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Bye.
Yes, have a good one. Take care. Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us.